Taylor and Marlon Brando are two of the people featured in this book, icons of the 20th century, 200 men and women who have made a difference. Barbara Cady compiled the book of essays and photos after a team of advisors came up with a list of who she says are the most influential and recognizable individuals of our time. She discusses those choices next at Book Soup Bookstore in West Hollywood, California.
What is that? Brownies. Oh, thank you.
Should I introduce myself? Of course. No, I want someone to introduce me. I have a long bio with tons of achievements and accolades from various people. No. Am I supposed to say who I am? All right. What if I forgot? All right. Here we are at Book Soup, celebrating the publishing of Barbara Cady's fabulous new book, Icons of the 20th Century. My husband, Stuart, and I'm Linda Resnick, Stuart Resnick. We're having this little party for Barb. We're glad you're here. Barbara is a writer. She's an editor. She's a publisher. She began her career in journalism as the book reviewer for the LA Times. Among her credits are launches of several publications, including a collector's magazine that she did for the Franklin Mint called The Almanac. She was the publisher of Franklin Heirloom Books and Signed First Editions. And Signed First Editions has published such famous authors as John Updike, Joyce Carol Oates, Tom Wolfe, E.L. Doctorow, Maya Angelou, etc., etc. Arthur Miller. She was also a host for 10 years of a talk radio show in Los Angeles, and she was the president of the Western Publications Association. She and her charming husband live in Philadelphia. I'd like to introduce to you Barbara Cady.
And save some guacamole for me, please. Thank you all very much for coming out in this cold, wintry. Let me just adjust the mic, okay? I'll start again. Can you all hear me? Is it? Now can you hear me? Really? Okay. So I'm going to start now. Thank you, Linda, very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out on this cold and wintry Hollywood evening. I'm not used to this weather. Let me begin with an observation. Fame is among the most powerful narcotics of the 20th century. Yes, there have always been famous people. They've been memorialized on coins and immortalized on canvas. And there has always been, thank goodness, gossip about famous people. But today, the 24-hour news cycle, round-the-clock cable programming, and an entertainment industry with an insatiable appetite for exploitation have taken fame to new and sometimes dangerous heights. I say dangerous in the sense that we seem to have become obsessed with media and with the people on which the media feed. To state it another way, too many school children today probably know much more about Leonardo DiCaprio than they do about Vladimir Lenin or Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Margaret Mead. Perhaps many adults do as well. Which may raise the question of whether or not my new book, Icons of the 20th Century, is just another book about famous people. Well, in one sense it is. The 200 men and women featured in it are quite well known. But they are much more than mere celebrities. They are giants. They are larger-than-life men and women who truly defined our century, whose deeds and whose faces, for good or ill, influence the way we perceive history and our contemporary world. They are cultural touchstones, heroes and anti-heroes who speak to us on many different spiritual and emotional levels, and yes, who even haunt our dreams. I speak personally of Elvis Presley. The faces of the 200 individuals and icons of the 20th century are as familiar to us as those of our relatives, for in a very real sense, we grew up with them, thanks to one of our century's more transforming innovations, the global media family. Our earliest brushes with adventure, fantasy, and romance were in their flickering screen presence, with film stars like John Wayne and Humphrey Bogart, Greta Garbo and Elizabeth Taylor. Even the iconic Marilyn Monroe, who was raised in Hollywood, fed her fantasy life through movies. As a teenager, she liked to imagine that Clark Gable was her father. And I suppose a few did in the audience as well. Ironically, she would go on to make a film with him, as we all know, The Misfits. Later, through the magic of television, Elvis, Bob Dylan, and the Beatles started a cultural youthquake right in our own living rooms while we watched them on TV. We attended the televised weddings of some of our more glamorous icons. Britain's Princess Diana comes to mind, and Monaco's Princess Grace, to name just two. And we mourned collectively at their funerals, and the funerals of others we felt we had come to know just as intimately. John F. Kennedy Jr., Martin Luther King, and most recently, Mother Teresa, the saint of the gutters. It is because of this familiarity that I and my partner, photography editor Jean-Jacques Naudet, decided to put the word icon in the title. Icon, of course, coming from the Greek word meaning image. And Icons of the 20th Century is a showcase for modern photography. But it is also, I'd like to add here, much more. It's really a photobiography, because in addition to the rare photo of each of the 200 icons, there is a 1,000-word biographical essay accompanying it. These comprehensive essays tell the fascinating life stories of every icon, placing each life in historical perspective. Let me point out here that I would not have dreamed of trying to come up with a list of 20th century icons on my own. Unlike many of the people I've written about, I have my limitations. I know what they are. I was, however, fortunate enough to enlist a group of 67 men and women from all over the world who know our century quite well, especially in their areas of expertise. This distinguished and generous advisory board ranged from former Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau to Olympic athlete Bruce Jenner, from Tom Garrity, Dean of the Wharton School of Business, to Pierre Rosenberg, head of the Louvre, and from world-renowned authors Joyce Carol Oates and Gay Talese to the Reverend Theodore Hesburgh, former president of Notre Dame, and from E. Graydon Carter, editor of Vanity Fair, to my host and friend, Linda Ray Resnick of the Franklin Mint, to Lord Alan Bullock and John Toland, both famed historians of the 21st century and authors who have written extensively on Hitler and Stalin. So it was an international panel, not just me, that provided the list of 200 people and icons of the 20th century. People whose incredible stories, I believe, provide a stunning overview of our century. And what an astounding century it's been. One that started out in promise, soon moved to international economic despair, and from there to a period of unparalleled horror. As our century was born, so was Charles Lindbergh, America's lone eagle, who first flew across the vast Atlantic alone. Picasso, the minotaur of modern art, was in his blue period, and Freud, the self-described archaeologist of the unconscious, was writing The Interpretation of Dreams. 3 years before the advent of the First World War, American President Ronald Reagan, who would play a decisive role in ending the Cold War, was born. And just the following year, Igor Stravinsky, the famed Russian composer, nearly started a riot in Paris with the debut of Rite of Spring. In a span of just 66 years, we went from Orville and Wilbur Wright's pioneering flight at Kitty Hawk to Neil Armstrong's first steps on the moon. Looks like some of my first dates. Aren't they cute? Our children changed. Yes. Boy, did they change, and so did the globe's taste in icons. From Caruso and Eddie Cantor, I don't remember them at all, to Callas and Sinatra, and then to Pavarotti and Madonna. So, whom did I and my 67 advisors pick to include in icons of the 20th century? Those I call the incomparables come to mind first. Super icons like Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, Anne Frank, the diarist of the Holocaust, Lady Diana, Helen Keller, Eleanor Roosevelt, and of course, again, Mother Teresa. The next easiest choices are probably the entertainers, people that certainly all you in Hollywood are familiar with, as well as people all around the globe. And the book includes a lot of magnificent ones that are all familiar to you. Greta Garbo, Mary Pickford, Brigitte Bardot, Judy Garland, Betty Davis, Marlene Dietrich, Katharine Hepburn. And we didn't forget our favorite mop top, Shirley Temple, our favorite redhead, Lucille Ball, and our favorite spy, Mata Hari, looking very much like Barbra Streisand, who is also an icon of the 20th century, as Fanny Brice in Funny Girl. Graphic artists like Frida Kahlo and Georgia O'Keeffe are present, as well as performing artists like Martha Graham and Maria Callas, and writers like the formidable Gertrude Stein, looking particularly happy, and Colette, but she does look like Gertrude Stein. Media mavens like Helen Gurley Brown and Betty Friedan made the list, as did other women of substance. Among them, the incomparable Amelia Earhart, Margaret Thatcher, Golda Meir, Margaret Mead, Simone de Beauvoir, Hannah Arendt, and Indira Gandhi. Don't you think for a moment, however, that I have left the men out of icons of the 20th century. Quite the contrary. In fact, male politicians, soldiers, and revolutionaries have put such a mark on our century that they almost obliterated our world. There's Adolf Hitler, of course, whose infamy needs no introduction, as well as Joseph Stalin, who caused more deaths than Hitler, and Mao Zedong, whose policies eliminated even more people than Hitler and Stalin combined. And then there are those whose awesome discoveries introduced for the first time in history the possibility of global annihilation. Enrico Fermi, Albert Einstein, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and of course, President Truman, who dropped the bomb, two actually. And lest we forget, there was also Francisco Franco, Emperor Hirohito, Che Guevara, Vladimir Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, Benito Mussolini, and Fidel Castro. I need not go on about the influence of men in the 20th century. All of them are icons, as are men of less frightening pursuits, gentler creatures such as Dr. Albert Schweitzer, the famed Bach historian and expert, playing probably Bach even as we see him here in his clinic in Gabon in the darkest of Africa. Cary Grant, Dr. Benjamin Spock, Vladimir Horowitz, Boris Pasternak, Marcel Proust. Aesthetic firebrands are plentiful in icons of the 20th century as well. Ernest Hemingway, here maybe with a shotgun that he committed suicide with, I don't know. One of the most imitated voices of the 20th century. And of course, Pablo Picasso, Rudolf Nureyev, Mick Jagger, Jackson Pollock, jazz great Charlie Parker. And athletes, the legendary slugger Babe Ruth, Olympian Jesse Owens, soccer king Pele, Pan-athlete Jim Thorpe, and football powerhouse Super Joe Namath. So what is it that makes an icon an icon? Well, idealism for one thing, certainly ambition. But as I came to understand, as I was researching and writing for 6 years, icons of the 20th century, not ambition of the usual kind. Icons, first and foremost, are driven people, people with a strong sense of self. Am I saying they're egomaniacs? Well, for the most part, yes. Even if their biographers often choose to disguise the fact. An interesting anecdote, I met a woman who met Mother Teresa on an airplane, told her how much she appreciated and admired her work. Mother Teresa gave her a Medal of St. Christopher. And when my friend exited the plane, found out from the stewardess that Mother Teresa had a medal for every single person on that plane. Now, there was a marketer of ideas. You know, I mean, a wonderful idea, but she really knew, you know, the power of selling. Then again, these icons could not have overcome what were often harrowing odds without this intense sense of self, and also without a deeply ingrained intimation of destiny. I think of de Gaulle and Churchill, both of whom as teenagers felt that their destiny was very entwined with that of their country, and they were taught that by their parents, by the way. They went from failure to failure. They dragged themselves up from poverty, crippling depression like Tennessee Williams, alcoholism like Jackson Pollock, physical abuse, handicaps, derision, even the threat of death. Failure to failure to failure until they found victory. And to contradict Woody Allen, who's also an icon of the 20th century, to contradict his definition of success, which is merely to show up, icons never, ever, ever, ever gave up. They always showed up and they always performed. And I think, of course, I think of Frida Kahlo, who, as you all know, was injured as a medical student, and a huge metal rod impaled her. She could never have children. She spent most of her time on her back in horrible pain, and the result are her beautiful canvases. While researching the lives of these incomparable people, I discovered that surprisingly all of them, heroes and villains alike, shared common characteristics. It runs like a river, I think, through the book. They tell us something, I think, about what's at the heart of achievement. The first is passion, the fire in the belly that incinerates all the obstacles separating desire from success. The second is performance, the will to stand and deliver, not just to show up, but to stand and deliver. The third is perseverance, the refusal to surrender before the impossible dream is achieved. And I think we are reminded always of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his stirring speech that memorable day in Washington, D.C., when he spoke about his dream. The fourth is perspective, the ability to perceive the big picture. There are a few, very few in life, who see the forest as well as the trees. Icons have far superior vision, seeing right through the forest branches to the stars. Let's consider passion first. All the icons exhibited unusual passion for their life's work. But let's take Madame Curie, a Polish scientist who grew up at the turn of the century and overcame huge barriers of prejudice against women to become the first woman professor in France. She was a gifted scientist, her brilliance burning as brightly as radium, which she discovered with her husband Pierre. With Pierre, she also won the Nobel Prize, the first woman to achieve that high honor. What many people don't realize, however, is that Madame Curie spent years in her cold, damp laboratory, not simply tinkering with beakers and chemicals, but shoveling pitchblende in the freezing cold of her lab. Day by day, ton by ton, she shoveled the ore from which she could extract the uranium and plutonium necessary for her experiments. She would become blind and eventually die of leukemia, a victim of overexposure to her own shining discovery. That is passion. Her notebooks, by the way, are still so radioactive that they cannot be touched. One of my favorite examples of an icon who was consumed by a burning desire to succeed is Fidel Castro, this century's most notorious guerrilla fighter, along, of course, with Che Guevara, and one of its few remaining dictators. Fidel Castro was not a man to be deterred. In December 1956, to give one example, and I think it's a kind of humorous example, Castro and his band landed on the coast of Cuba's Oriente province, where they soon found themselves surrounded by troops of his sworn enemy, Fulgencio Batista. Suffering from cold, hunger, blistering thirst, the barefoot revolutionaries hid, quaking in the sugar cane. And I think it is safe to say that many in the rank and file did not have a lot of faith in Fidel's strategic talents at this particular point. Yet Fidel had one fan in the ranks himself. The man who would later build the first communist state in the Western Hemisphere whispered excitedly to his companions, and this is according to his biographer, "We are winning. Victory will be ours." That's passion. Let's quickly move to the second shared trait of icons, performance. In fact, most of the lives and icons of the 20th century are reminders of the old adage that diamonds form only under extreme pressure. Consider Dwight Eisenhower. As a youth, he seemed an unlikely hero. He was born in an obscure Texas town and married his sweetheart, Mamie Dowd, who was so inept at housekeeping that Ike had to clean and cook. And as I mentioned to my friends before, she was also very inept at hairstyling with those incredible bangs she wore all those years in the 50s. I hope that the men in the audience will note, as we move along here, the indisputable link between Ike's cooking and cleaning and his eventual professional glory. Anyway, following World War I, his rank was reduced, and he was assigned to coach Army post football, which was enjoyable, I suppose, but quite embarrassing for him. But he kept persevering, and eventually, as we all know, was given command of the Allied forces in Europe, where he was required to keep the likes of George Patton, Field Marshal Montgomery, and Charles de Gaulle in line, an incredible ego we were talking about before. It was Ike, of course, who directed the great invasion that would liberate Europe. The scope of his responsibilities were breathtaking. The Allied armies included millions of men fighting under a dozen flags, with clouds of airplanes, vast fleets of warships. And on D-Day, June 6, 1944, Ike oversaw Operation Overlord, as we all know, sending 2.5 million men against Hitler's armies. To top off his career, he won 2 presidential elections and not a few rounds of golf. That is performance. The same is true of Babe Didrikson Zaharias. Babe was a one-woman all-star team and was called the greatest athlete of all time. She was a track and field star in her youth and later put women's pro golf on the map as the first American to win the British women's amateur title. Babe could drive a ball 300 yards, and she used to say, when I really want to blast one, I just loosen my girdle and let her fly. She could throw a football over half the length of a football field and once struck out Joe DiMaggio, who, of course, would later go on to marry the iconic Marilyn Monroe. Babe's life ended hard after a long battle with cancer, but even that terrible time was garnished with a grace note. In the hospital room where she finally expired, attendants found her golf bag propped up in a corner. In case she would have another remission, she was ready to play another 18 holes. That's performance and also passion and perseverance. With regard to this last trait, there are many, many interesting examples of perseverance in icons of the 20th century. But one of my favorites is the magnificent Wilma Rudolph. The odds were certainly stacked against this courageous Afro-American from birth. As if being born dirt poor wasn't enough, she was born with polio. She was also the 20th of 22 children, which of course means that her mother qualifies for icon status. Wilma eventually learned to walk with no limp, and then to run and run and run 20 miles a day, 5 days a week. And in the 1960 Olympics, was not only crowned the fastest woman in the world, she became the first American woman to win 3 gold medals in a single Olympics and took the 3 gold medals all in a single day. She used to nap during her races, you know. Grace under pressure. On the other side of the world in India, Mohandas Gandhi embodied a similar perseverance. Living under British occupation, Gandhi proved that all the power of empire was no match for the plodding, persevering pacifism of millions of Indians, led by this one frail man. His great journey was inspired by a racist incident. While working as a lawyer in South Africa, he was thrown out of the first-class section of a train and later beaten by a coach driver for refusing to give up his seat to a European. His tactics baffled and infuriated his opponents. He is a dangerous and uncomfortable enemy, a British observer once remarked. You can capture Gandhi's body, but it gives you no purchase on his soul. His long life of dedication to national independence for his people was rewarded, as we all know, by an assassin's bullet. And just hours before he was shot, by the way, another icon of the 20th century, Henri Cartier-Bresson, the famous French photojournalist, snapped his picture. This is not the picture, by the way. Finally, there is the quality of perspective, which is found in those truly visionary, big idea people. Here again, icons of the 20th century is rich with examples, but I would like to end with Winston Churchill. I believe that during the darkest hour of this century, it was this man who kept alive the hope of the free world. Without his perspective, perseverance, passion, and performance, and obviously the sacrifices of millions of fighting men and women around the world, and of course FDR, and yes, Stalin, you and I would probably not be meeting here this evening, or if we were, we might be conversing in German with stormtroopers at the door. Churchill definitely understood the big picture. He saw the Nazi threat early on and was ridiculed for his warnings, but he never gave up. In the darkest hours, he showed Britain how to keep a stiff upper lip by his own example, braving Hitler's rocket attacks on London along with its citizens, often climbing up to a rooftop to view the devastation during an air attack. He strategized brilliantly with the Allies. He flew planes. He painted watercolors. He ate a lot. He drank a lot. He smoked a lot, and was not, to put it mildly, the type to have palled around with the Surgeon General. He wrote books, winning a Nobel Prize for Literature. but no award matched his stature as the man who conquered the man who wanted to conquer the world. Politician, soldier, man of the arts, Churchill is magnificent in icons of the 20th century, looking every inch the statesman with his wonderful bulldog face and that wonderful crumpled cigar. I'm surprised they haven't put him on Cigar Aficionado. Maybe they have. As we prepare to begin a new century and a new millennium, the lives of icons like Winston Churchill remind us of the qualities of character that will be vital to leading us into the next 1,000 years. The qualities especially of perseverance and passion, necessary for the advancement of an enlightened society, and perhaps for the survival of civilization itself. If we are lucky, we're going to be blessed by the visions of new Picassos, new Martha Grahams, new Stravinskys. It must be our hope that our children and grandchildren, if not ourselves, will enjoy an artistic, social, and economic flowering even more amazing than that of the fading century. Yet if the past is prologue, we will also have need of new Churchills, de Gaulles, Martin Luther Kings, and Mother Teresas. I know that each of you, my audience, will bring your own opinions to icons of the 20th century, and certainly you will take issue with some of the choices. But I urge you to spend some time with these 200 compelling people. Their lives are simply extraordinary, and no matter what you may know about any of them, I guarantee that you will learn something new and astonishing about each of them. And by becoming familiar with them, hone your own personal radar, your own sense of history, so you will perhaps be able to sense the icons of the 21st century. Thank you very much. Any questions? Questions? Yes.
How long did it take you, Barbara, to do those 6 years?
6 fun-filled years, yes. And an equal amount of time to source the photography, which came from private and public archives and personal collectors all over the world, gathered by my partner, who's a very well-known photography editor with Perry Match and American Photo NL. And he did a wonderful job, I think, but it took 6 years to put it all together. We'd get big batches of photos, go through them, and we were searching for photos that reflected the iconness, the power, the impactfulness of each person. And sometimes we'd go through 3, 4, 5 batches before we would find the one, and sometimes we'd get a batch from an archive, and the photo would just be right there. We would just know immediately.
Very cool.
Thank you. Yes?
How many times would you say that you changed the final 200 people?
In my mind, I have a basement filled with lists. In the beginning, yeah, I started out with 100, and I had couldn't narrow. It grew to 200, so it was extremely difficult. But the reason why I went from 100 to 200 was because the politicians and the soldiers threatened to overcome the book, and there was no way that you could leave out some of these incredibly powerful people. So in order to really show what the century was all about and to have cultural icons and people that had influenced the way we thought and the way we behave as social beings, famous writers and dancers, we expanded it to include 200 people, taking the nominations from these people all over the world and enhancing the original list and refining it. Yes?
Do you have 3 favorite icons, personally, that influenced you in any way?
Well, I think my favorite would have to be Mother Teresa, because she was so old and worked so hard, and she slept on the floor, and she never asked anybody to do anything that she wouldn't do herself, which I think is a wonderful lesson. And she gave love, and in taking care of poverty, understood that love, the absence of love, was the same thing as the absence of food, in the absence of clothing, in the absence of wealth, that if nobody loved you, you were poor. I think the most fascinating person, aside, of course, from Winnie, as I've come to know and love him, is Chairman Mao. Here in Hollywood, everybody talks a lot about the story arc, the character arc, and Mao had an incredible life. He started out extremely idealistic, young, a dedicated teacher, a brilliant poet, loved to write, read everything he could get his hands on, was influenced by Western thought, Western books. Lived in a cave for years while he was developing his thought and while he was gathering his communist forces. And then went on the incredible long march, you know, over 7 mountain ranges, 12 rivers, et cetera, married several times, was sexually active into his 70s, you know, was swimming in the Yangtze River, and became completely mad. I mean, he was a nutcase. He went from this incredible revolutionary, this thought provoker, this social and economic visionary into insanity, you know, in the period of his lifetime. And I just find him completely fascinating. And of course, Elvis, but, you know. Did he pay any attention to me? No. Anybody else with a question?
As you did your research, were there facts about the individuals that came out that surprised you, or do we pretty much know each of the individuals through history and the way they've been documented over time?
You know, the thing that was the most interesting is how many of these icons knew each other. No, really, they were having coffee together, they were having affairs together, they were autographing each other's books, they were going on trips together. The famous French singer, Edith Piaf, wore an emerald all of her life that was given to her by Marlene Dietrich. You know, Jackie Kennedy had dinner with Frank Sinatra. I found a picture on the cover of Scientific American of Albert Einstein in a tuxedo with Charlie Chaplin in a tuxedo going to an event together. I mean, you can't ask for any more polarity than that. So that was the thing that I found interesting. Oh, and there were a lot of incredible things, amazing details about these people. But that I thought was very interesting, that you think they're sort of isolated and they're in their own sphere of power and intellect, but they all hang out together in one way or another.